In a first for India and Indian company law, the Companies Act 2013 relies heavily on rules to convey the full import of the change in law. Most of the draft rules are now in the public domain for you to read and mull over. Or you can just watch this special edition of The Firm, because today we have a multidisciplinary panel here to take you through the many surprises that these rules have thrown up. I'm joined by Narayan Shankar, Vice President and Company Secretary at M&M, Yogesh Sharma, Audit Partner, Grant Thornton, Manan Lahoti, he's Corporate Lawyer and Partner at Luthra, and Vivek Gupta, who's the M&A Head and Partner at BMR. Gentlemen, to all four of you, a very warm welcome. The first issue I want to start with are two definitions that cut across the Act and impact all stakeholders. The first one is the definition of relative. The list of people that qualify as relatives under this Act and these rules is far shorter than what the 1956 Act had, and that should have made you happy. Instead, most of you are fairly perturbed by this definition. Why?
Today, if you see the Companies Act 1956, nuclear family was not there. It was more joint family was in vogue. Today, with nuclear family, the whole concept of relative today, whether in terms of independent directors or auditors, there are huge responsibilities cast, and today with the 15 type of relatives which
but it's still fairly close, right? It's your parents, it's your husband or wife,
it goes 2 generations
it's
above,
your children
it goes 2
and your
generations
son's
down.
children, that's it.
So you'll have to see it from the perspective of, is the concerned director able to exercise influence or control any one of those relatives? So ideally, the suggestion would be to get into, instead of getting into a prescriptive mode, you can just define it as dependent parents or dependent children who are dependent on the concerned director or a KMP, or you have a concept of an immediate relative, or you just say people who are financially dependent on the director.
Okay,
it becomes much more easier.
I thought the list was fairly close. It says spouse, father, father's parents, mother, mother's parents, children, sons' children, not daughters' children, and brother, including stepbrother. I don't know. Do all of you agree with what Narayan is saying, that this list is not good enough, that it casts too wide a net?
No, it depends. It would depend on where the term relative has actually been used.
So how does it impact auditors?
So for example, let's say auditor gets disqualified to be an auditor if his relative has performed certain acts, entered into certain transactions, or bought certain securities worth, let's say, 1 lakh rupee face value.
Of the company that you intend to audit, right?
Absolutely. Just taking a very simple example. Let's say I have a estranged, financially independent elder brother who has his own business. He cannot enter into and should not have an indebtedness of 1 lakh rupee or more with the company
that you
to which I am going to, and not only the company, it's the holding company of that company, a subsidiary company of that company, associated company of that company.
But is that too much to ask for? I mean, honestly, Vivek, I know you're going to object to it. Is that too much to ask for, that if Yogesh is the auditor to a company, Yogesh's immediate relatives, his brother, his sister, his parents or his children, must not have a financial relationship with that company?
So conceptually that is right. So I think the good part about this new definition is that the daughter-in-law of my sister-in-law is not included. The problem is that this definition has universally been applied to all situations. So I'm all for it if you say that in terms of disclosure of transactions of the company with related parties, you have a very extensive list. Where I start having a problem is if you tell me to ensure that 2 generations above, 2 generations below, or on people who have no direct control, they should not have shares worth more than 1 lakh rupees. So let's say today I have to audit ICICI Bank. If any one of my so-called relatives in this definition of 15 hold shares with face value of more than 1 lakh, I cannot audit ICICI Bank. That cannot be the intent of this section. So in a variety of situations, different definitions are required.
I get it. So what you're saying is that the long list works if it only pertained to additional disclosures. But the moment you start using the list to make restrictions on what can or cannot be done, then it becomes too long a list in that sense.
And I would even argue it's difficult to administer.
Even for capital market transactions, to make disclosures for this whole host of relatives, it's just not practical at all. A number of situations in India where, like he said, the brothers may not speak to brothers. The information will not be available, one. To which I quite like, by comparison, of course, I quite like the definition that SEBI uses for relatives. Much shorter.
How is it different?
So it basically includes the parents, it includes the siblings, it includes the children of the person, also of the spouse. It's still larger than probably what
But
it
it's the
should
same.
be.
It's exactly the
It's
same.
slightly
Parents,
more than that.
siblings,
Slightly more than that.
parents,
It
siblings,
goes
children.
up 2 level and it goes down 2 level.
And children's
Definition has to be in the context of the provision you are discussing. If you are discussing independence, it has to be based on financial dependence. If it's for related party, then it's a different matter. It has to be based on the context you are trying to get into.
Okay, all right. I get the broad gist of what you all are trying to say. I want to move to the second definition that again, has many people irked, and that is the definition of related party. And Narayan, I think you're saying that again it casts the net too wide.
Related party today currently is not defined under the Act. Related party is defined under the accounting standard, and they broadly fall into 2 buckets. One where you can exercise control, and the second where you can exercise significant influence. Today, under the Companies Act, they have defined 2013, the new
So
one.
the rules have defined related parties.
Related parties, and the net has widened beyond imagination. For example, a director or a KMP of your company is fine, but if you're saying a director or a key managerial personnel of your holding company, of your subsidiary, of your associate, and relatives of those people are all going to be related parties, where you can't have a single transaction with them. Not only that, even key managerial people and their relatives of the holdco, subsidiary, associates. If you, just for example, if I can give, suppose a company has say 100 subsidiaries and 10 related party, 10 KMPs and directors all put together, and even if they have 10 out of the 15 relations alive, so you're talking about 10,000 people who have to be tracked across.
But given the abuse we've seen of related party transactions in this country, isn't it fair that they've expanded the net?
Again, if it was for the purpose of disclosure, it's fine.
But
if you're going to it's going to be restrictive.
But it is disclosure. It's not restrictive, right?
It's restrictive because you can't enter into a transaction with either any of the related parties
without board approval or
and
special resolution, depending on what kind of company you are.
And the penal provisions are, you can say, very onerous. In case inadvertently, if a director, even if a relative enters into a transaction, A, the independent director will be disqualified as being an independent, and B, if it is a related party transaction and if the director concerned would not even be aware that a transaction, he has to compensate the company and approval has to be taken within 3 months. You would not even be aware that a particular transaction has been actually taken place in one corner.
I get the point.
And I have a slightly different problem really. I think the accounting standard definition of related parties has to be the same as the Companies Act.
It can't be different.
It should not be different because for Companies Act, for the first time they've introduced a definition of related party, and this is slightly different from the one that I've seen under the Accounting Standard 18.
That's what Narayan pointed out.
Right, but the problem it creates for a capital markets transaction is we need to give disclosures of all related party transactions. Till now, we used to align the disclosures to what was there in the accounts.
Accounting standards.
Now you have 2 sets.
definitions.
That's
to
right,
work
2
with.
sets, and
This
one is
seems to
very
plague
viable.
Us, right? This plagues us with several definitions that are common across several acts, whether it's
That's
things
right.
like control, which is more complex, or it's things like, related party, which is simpler and should have been stuck to it.
Or even
in terms of
KMPs
one.
for that matter, key managerial personnel, or
Just to
promoters.
add on, and rules provide even functional heads to be the related parties. Now, functional heads could be anyone. Functional head is a purchase head, your sales head, R&D head, whether the function is relevant to the company or it may not be so relevant. But the functional heads are covered without any definition for functional heads. So it's got to be wait and see how functional heads is going to get defined and interpreted.
I get it. All right. The third definition I wanted to bring in, and it's not strictly a definition, but I'll bring it in nonetheless. And Yogesh, this impacts your fraternity, the issue of what constitutes a business relationship. Because it says that you cannot be an auditor to a company if you have a business relationship with that company. And then it goes on to elaborate that that means any transaction entered into for a commercial purpose. Now, what commercial purpose means is a big question mark, and that again precludes you from, let's say, auditing a company like, for instance, Vodafone, if you have a Vodafone service on your phone, is it?
Yeah. So it's going to be a major challenge for, and in case that we yet to
Look, my example was extreme. I don't think that that the Ministry for Corporate Affairs is going to look at it that way. But I'm just wondering, is that how you're reading it?
But the theoretical reading of the rule is exactly the same.
As extreme.
So it's transaction of any commercial purpose. So it could be anything. Now I'm a Tata Power user and probably disqualified for being appointed as an auditor for Tata Power. So it's gonna create a challenge.
I'm sorry, I want to laugh, but
No, maybe an
it just
extreme.
sounds absurd. It is extreme.
Extreme interpretation, but intent is right. So again, it goes back to the basic fundamentals that auditor has to be independent of the company.
Yeah.
Point is, what is that which should be disqualified from a transaction coverage perspective from for making auditor an independent party? Now, a transaction which has been entered at arm's length, which is there in the related party transaction approval as well, and I think those definitions and those concepts have to be applied
So
even
they should have put arm's length into that, and if the moment they put arm's length into that, then you'd be clear of at least not having to disconnect your power supply or change your service provider, right?
Absolutely.
Okay, fine. All right.
Materiality thresholds also in the act,
Yeah,
right?
I get it.
Holding 1 lakh rupees worth of shares of Infosys, coming back
Face
to my
value, par
face
value,
value,
yeah.
coming back to my favorite example, or Mahindra and Mahindra, is not going to give you any influence on those companies, trust me. So there has to be some materiality threshold which is perhaps even defined with reference to the company in question. The compliance costs for these companies also must be seen. So while rulemaking is a good thing, in principle I agree with you. In principle I think we are headed down the right track. Related parties should be disclosed. People who have abused the system should not be allowed to abuse the system. But in doing all of this, you can't take such extreme steps. The pendulum cannot completely swing to the extent it has.